A day in the life inside a 14th-century monastery. The full history. These are the men who shaped medieval civilization from behind stone walls, waking before sunrise to pray, copying books by hand, brewing ale, caring for the dying, and feeding strangers at the gate, all while forbidden from speaking above a whisper. This is a full account of what life actually looked like inside a 14th-century monastery, from the first bell ringing at 2 in the morning to the last prayer before nightfall. To understand a single day inside a 14th-century monastery, you first have to understand the world that built it. By the early 1300s, England alone counted nearly 500 separate monastic houses, and spread across those institutions were roughly 17,500 monks, nuns, and friars, a number that represented most of the country's literate population. These places operated as hospitals, schools, archives, farms, breweries, and guesthouses, often all at once. A medieval traveler, a sick peasant, or a king passing through the countryside all stopped at the same gate. The foundation of everything traces back to one man. Benedict of Nursia was born around 480 AD in central Italy, spent years as a hermit, and then did something no one before him had quite managed. He wrote down the rules. Around 530 AD, his completed manuscript became known as the Rule of Saint Benedict, a book of precepts in Latin designed to organize communal life under the authority of an abbot. The motto of the tradition he started was 3 words: ora et labora, pray and work. 8 canonical prayer services every single day came out of that rule, spread across the hours of light and darkness. These 8 services, the divine office, or opus dei, meaning the work of God, were not suggestions. They formed the spine of the day, and everything else, meals, labor, sleep, and study, was arranged in the gaps between them. 24 popes, 200 cardinals, 7,000 archbishops, 15,000 bishops, and 1,500 canonized saints had come out of Benedictine monasteries by the beginning of the 14th century, according to records compiled at that time. The reach of this institution into European political and religious life stretched into every corner of the continent. None of that mattered much to the average monk inside one of those 500 English houses, though, because the bell was about to ring at 2 in the morning. The monastic day did not start at sunrise. It started in the dark. Vigils, sometimes called matins, began around 2 a.m. and ran longer than any other service. Monks rose from their beds and walked to the church fully clothed, because Chapter 22 of the Rule of Saint Benedict required exactly that. Sleep in your habit, dressed at all times as if ready for the Lord. The reasoning was partly modesty and partly practicality, and the practical side was the point that mattered at 2 a.m. No dressing, no delay. Just get up and walk. The dormitory where every monk slept was a communal room without private space, without curtains, without personal furniture of any kind. Straw-filled mattresses lined the walls in rows. Talking after lights out brought punishment, and the dormitory was patrolled through the night to confirm that silence held and no candles were burning. Because fire in a stone building filled with manuscripts and wooden furniture carried consequences that went well beyond a single room. By the 14th century, a small accommodation had been made. General chapter records from that period show that priors and sub-priors could now construct cells inside the dormitory. Small private spaces with actual locks on the doors, and it appears that partitions were added for other monks around the same time. The common monks' quarters remained shared, but the era of the entirely undivided dormitory was starting to give way. The walk to church from the dormitory was made without a word. Vigils itself covered psalms, scripture readings, and passages from older theological texts, because the rule required the full 150 psalms to be recited across a single week, every week, without variation. A monk who entered at 20 and died at 60 had recited the complete Psalter somewhere north of 2,000 times. After vigils ended, the monks stayed up, reading in private prayer, and waited for the next service. Lauds came at around 3 a.m., directly after vigils in most houses. The name came from the Latin for praise, and this was the formal start of the new day in the monastic calendar, even though sunrise was still hours away. A period of private reading or meditation followed laudes, and then prime arrived at 6 a.m. with the light. Prime was brief, and after it came the chapter meeting, which was not brief at all. Every monk attended the chapter meeting. The abbot or prior ran it, and it opened with a reading from the Rule of Saint Benedict, 1 chapter per day, which is precisely why the room was called the chapter house. After the reading, monks were permitted to speak, and this was one of the only formally structured occasions in the day where that was true. Confessions of personal fault came here, administrative decisions came here, and punishments came here, announced and carried out in front of everyone. The escalation of discipline followed a careful sequence. A first offense brought a warning, handled quietly. A second brought exclusion from communal life, which meant eating alone, being barred from leading any part of the offices, and losing the right to speak to the other monks. When that failed, corporal punishment followed, administered before the assembled community in the chapter house. And for the monk who refused to change after all of that, the final answer was expulsion from the monastery entirely. After the chapter meeting ended, the working day opened. Pray and work. The rule divided the waking hours into roughly equal portions of prayer, manual labor, and sacred reading, and the labor portion covered a range of tasks that would surprise anyone who pictures monks as purely contemplative figures. Cooking, serving, washing up, laundry, running errands inside the compound, managing the gate, receiving guests, farming, tending the sick, managing cellars and storehouses, and the complex financial operations of a medieval institution. All of that was monastic labor. Monks were assigned as obedientiaries, holders of specific offices responsible for defined areas of operations, and the administrative structure that supported this was more elaborate than most people imagine. At St. Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury, a record survives from 1322 showing the cellarer, the monk in charge of food and drink supplies, running a staff of more than 30 people, including cooks, kitchen workers, guards, porters, and purchasing agents who bought and sold goods on the monastery's behalf. One monk, one department, 30 people reporting to him. Standing above all of it was the abbot, whose authority inside the monastery walls was absolute. The word abbot comes from the Aramaic for father, and the role was understood in exactly those terms. Senior monks selected him, and he held the position for life. Abbots in the 14th century tended to come from noble families and often carried political responsibilities that took them outside the monastery for weeks at a time, which meant the prior, second in command, handled most of the daily reality of running the place, dealing with discipline, business, and everything the abbot had left behind. Between the 5th and 13th centuries, monasteries were the only places in Western Europe where books were made. By the 14th century, commercial workshops in Paris, Rome, and the Netherlands had started pulling that work away from the cloister. But monastic scriptoria were still operating and still producing, and in many houses the scriptorium remained the most intellectually significant room in the building. The room itself was large, linked almost always to the library, and built with wide windows because the scribes who worked there needed as much natural light as possible. They worked at angled writing tables, quill pens in hand, and they stopped when the light failed. Because no candles or lamps came anywhere near the manuscripts, fire near parchment and ink was not a risk any scriptorium director was willing to take. The manuscript did not begin with writing. It began with the parchment itself, which meant beginning with a dead animal. Monks soaked animal hides in water, scraped them to remove the hair, stretched them on wooden frames to dry, and bleached them with lime to produce a surface clean enough to write on. A single large Bible required the hides of approximately 500 sheep. A director, usually a senior monk, supervised the work, distributed pages to individual scribes, and maintained the silence of the room. Monks wrote only what they were assigned, looked at no one else's work, and did not stop until their pages were finished for the day. What came out of these rooms included not just religious texts but histories, legal documents, medical treatises, agricultural manuals, and classical philosophy. Which is why calling the monastery the internet of its age is not much of an exaggeration. No medieval monk ever took a formal vow of silence. That's the misconception, and it's worth clearing up before going further, because the reality is more interesting. What the Rule of Saint Benedict actually said was that monks should diligently cultivate silence at all times. That was the standard, not absolute prohibition, but a constant, serious, disciplined effort to keep speech to a minimum. In practice, silence was treated with enough weight that breaking it carried real consequences, but the picture was not one of mute men floating through stone corridors. At Cluniac monasteries, one of the major Reformed Benedictine congregations, speech was reduced to 2 short supervised periods per day, morning and afternoon. And even those conversations were expected to be as short as possible. Gossip was banned. Laughter, actual laughter, the unrestrained kind, was treated by the rule as incompatible with monastic life and explicitly prohibited. Where speech was impossible, hand signs took over. Different monasteries developed their own sign languages over time, with documented systems covering dozens of objects and requests. A monk could ask for bread, wine, fish, a book, or a candle without opening his mouth. And in a Cluniac house he probably did so multiple times a day. The monks who struggled with silence were not necessarily the disruptive ones. The rule assumed imperfection and built the discipline structure around it, a graduated system of correction that started gentle and ended severe. Because the assumption was that a person would fail to live up to the ideal and would need help getting back to it. Monastic life was not presented as something that came naturally. It was presented as something a person spent a lifetime working at. Meals in the refectory were eaten in silence, and a monk reading from a religious text from a raised pulpit filled the room while the others ate. Commenting on the food, responding to the reading out loud, or speaking to the monk next to you were not permitted. What was on the table, though, had changed significantly from what the rule originally intended. Benedict of Nursia had prohibited the flesh of 4-legged animals for monks in good health. For several centuries that held, with meat reserved for the sick and infirm. That changed in 1336, when Pope Benedict XII issued the papal constitution Summi Magistri, which permitted meat on 4 days per week outside of fast days. Records from that era show monasteries eating beef, mutton, pork, veal, and suckling pig, along with poultry and game including swan, cygnet, chicken, duck, and goose, a diet that would have been unrecognizable to the monks of 3 centuries earlier. The daily standard ration came from the rule itself, 2 meals a day, 2 cooked dishes at each. Every monk received approximately 1 pound of bread per day and around 280 milliliters of wine, roughly 10 fluid ounces. Beer was treated as food rather than drink, and at Westminster Abbey each monk's daily allowance ran to 1 imperial gallon of ale, 4.5 liters, with no cap set in the rule the way there was for wine. Pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, was the backbone of most meals, supplemented with cabbage, turnips, carrots, peas, onions, and beans. Salt was the main seasoning. Pepper was considered a luxury because it came from far away and cost accordingly, which meant it rarely appeared in the common refectory. On feast days, anniversaries, or when the abbot returned from a long absence, monks received pittances, supplementary foods that might mean fine white bread instead of the usual darker loaf, or a plate of something that never appeared otherwise. Every monastery of any size maintained an infirmary, and the monk who ran it, the infirmarius, held one of the more demanding positions in the house. No formal medical training existed in the way it would develop later, so the infirmarius learned through experience, through the medical manuscripts in the library, and through the accumulated herbal knowledge the community had built up over generations. Monastic libraries typically held copies of Galen and Hippocrates, Arabic medical scholarship translated into Latin, and detailed herbals documenting the properties of the plants growing in the monastery garden. Sick monks received privileges the healthy did not. The rule's prohibition on meat did not apply to the infirm, even in periods when the general community ate no meat at all, because recovery needed fuel. The calefactory, the one room in most monasteries with actual heating, was accessible to the sick, while the rest of the community worked and prayed in cold stone spaces through the winter months. The infirmary's reach extended beyond the monastery's own population. Pilgrims and travelers who arrived at the gate too ill to continue were received into the guest house first, and transferred to the infirmary when necessary. The line between hospitality and medical care blurred constantly in practice, because poverty, exhaustion, and malnutrition often looked like illness by the time a person reached the gate, and the monk who answered the knock had to make that call in real time. The monastery was not a closed world, and anyone who thinks otherwise has missed a significant part of what made these institutions work. The almoner, the monk responsible for charitable acts on behalf of the house, managed the distribution of alms to the poor of the surrounding area, and records are specific about what arriving pilgrims received. 1 pound of bread on the first day of their stay, half a pound on the second, and half a monk's measure of wine each day. Wealthier visitors were received in the guest house, a separate building with better accommodations, where the abbot might dine with them and where the usual silence rules bent to allow actual conversation. Receiving every guest as if receiving Christ himself was the rule's instruction, and monasteries took it seriously, partly out of genuine spiritual obligation, and partly because visitors brought things the monastery needed. They brought news from outside, patronage, trade connections, and information about what was happening in a world that the monks could not easily go and see for themselves. The economic scale of a major monastery by the 14th century was considerable. These institutions held land, collected rents, operated mills, ran markets, and functioned as credit sources. The cellarer at Canterbury, managing a staff of 30 in 1322, was not an exception. Running a large monastery meant running something closer to a small town, with all the purchasing agents and guards and porters that implied. Through the morning's work, the canonical hours kept arriving, and monks kept stopping what they were doing to answer them. Terce came at roughly 9 a.m., a short service at the 3rd hour of daylight. Sext followed at midday. None landed in the mid-afternoon, and its name carries a piece of history. The English word noon descends from none, after centuries of the service gradually shifting earlier in the day until it moved from the 9th hour to the middle. Each of these afternoon offices was short. A practiced community could complete terce or sext in minutes. But they required the monk to set down whatever was in his hands, the quill, the ladle, the spade, walk to the church, pray, and return. No stretch of work in a monastery ever ran more than a few hours before that interruption arrived. This was the design. The rule was not trying to maximize output. What it was trying to do was ensure that the monk's attention cycled back, repeatedly and throughout the day, to the reason he was there in the first place, not the farm, not the book, not the kitchen. The work was real and necessary, but it was always secondary. As daylight faded, Vespers arrived at around 6 p.m., one of the longer and more elaborate services, second in weight only to vigils. After Vespers came a brief period of spiritual reading or communal instruction, and then the final service of the day, Compline. The name comes from the Latin completorium, meaning completion, and that's exactly what it was, the close of the day's formal prayer. Short, often sung, quiet in character, Compline settled something in the monastic atmosphere. When it ended, the great silence began. From the close of Compline until after Lowe's the following morning, speech was absolutely prohibited. More strictly than at any other point in the day, the great silence held the entire monastery. Beds came by 8 p.m. in winter and 9 p.m. in summer, monks in their habits, on straw mattresses, in the communal dormitory, under patrol. Within a few hours, the bell would ring again. Not every monastery in 14th century England operated from the same playbook, and the differences between the major orders were visible the moment you looked at what the monks were wearing. The Benedictines were the oldest and most established, and their black habits gave them the name black monks. Their houses tended toward size and wealth, and by the 14th century a Benedictine abbot in a major house was often more political figure than cloistered monk. The Cistercians had broken from the Benedictines in 1098, arguing that the older order had drifted too far from the austerity the rule intended. Their undyed wool habits came out grayish-white, which earned them the name white monks. Their monasteries went up in remote valleys, away from towns, and their interpretation of monastic life put physical labor and material simplicity above the scholarly and administrative prestige the Benedictines had accumulated. The Franciscans were something different again. Founded by Francis of Assisi around 1209, They were friars rather than monks, not enclosed in a single house but moving through the world, preaching. Their gray habits made them the Gray Friars. The Franciscan ideal was radical poverty, and unlike the Benedictines or Cistercians, they were meant to own nothing at all, not even the buildings they slept in. All three orders issued their monks essentially the same wardrobe: 2 tunics, 2 cowls, a scapular for work, and shoes and stockings. The second tunic existed so one could be washed while the other was being worn. Every monk slept in his habit. Every monk worked in his scapular. The color of the cloth was where the differences started. Everything described in this video: the orderly schedule, the 8 daily prayers, the meals eaten in silence, the manuscripts copied by hand, the careful governance of a complex institution, all of it existed in a world that 1348 came for. The Black Death reached England that year, and monasteries were among the first places it spread. The reasons were structural, not accidental. Monks slept in shared dormitories, ate in shared refectories, and gathered in shared rooms multiple times every day. They also received a constant stream of visitors: pilgrims, travelers, the sick, royal delegations, the poor at the gate. Every person who walked through was a potential source of infection, and the communal life that made the monastery function was exactly what made it so exposed. Historians estimate that about half of England's monastic population died within roughly 2 years of the epidemic's worst phase. Before 1348, approximately 17,500 monks, nuns, and friars lived across England's 500 or so houses. Within 2 years, records suggest that not far short of half of them were dead. With friars hit hardest, and monks and nuns somewhat less so, though no category escaped. Entire monasteries went dark. Some, left with only a handful of survivors, simply stopped functioning and closed. The institutions that survived carried the damage for generations. Smaller, slower to recruit, and in some cases financially weakened, the post-plague monastery was a diminished version of what it had been. The network of 500 houses and 17,500 people never fully rebuilt itself. English monasteries would continue operating until Henry VIII dissolved them between 1536 and 1541. But the world that existed on the morning of January 1st, 1348, was gone before the decade ended. A day inside a 14th-century monastery started before the sun rose and ended on a straw mattress, with a bell already scheduled to ring again a few hours later, with 8 prayer services marking the time in between. The men who lived this life were not all saints, and the records make that clear. Chapter house proceedings document punishments, confessions of fault, cases of monks who talked when they should have been silent, ate what they were not supposed to eat, and occasionally walked out the gate and did not come back. The monastery was a human institution, built by human beings and populated by human beings working to live up to something they frequently fell short of. What they built anyway held for centuries. The manuscripts they copied sit in libraries today. The agricultural methods developed on monastic farms ran through European food production for generations. The care they extended to the sick, the traveling stranger, and the poor at the gate existed at a time when almost nothing else did. And every morning, before the sun came up, the bell rang at 2, and they got out of bed,